In Irish poetry of this time, the good monk was frequently portrayed as the good copyist, carefully tracing across parchment the holy words of these scriptures. A hedge of trees is all around, the blackbird's song I shall not hide. Above my book so smoothly lined, the birds are singing far and wide. In a green cloak of bushy boughs, the cuckoo pipes his melody. God, be good to me, God, on Judgment Day. How well I write beneath these trees. Coin scrivam for roedda Rus. In these and later centuries, the Celtic churches produced in their native languages, in Irish, in Scots Gaelic, and in Welsh, some of the most exquisite religious poetry ever written in Europe. One of the most significant aspects of this church at the end of the world was that it very soon found its own voice in its own language. But of course, we must never entirely trust an Irish poet. Like other poems, this poem presents the life of the monk as a sheltered idyll. What this idyllic description overlooks is the sheer labor and expense of copying the Holy Scriptures in the conditions of the 6th and 7th centuries A.D. It was back-breaking, finger-numbing work. My hand is weary with writing, my sharp great point is not thick, a steady stream of wisdom springs from my well-coloured pen. Oh, but my hand is weary, weary. To make a copy of the 4 Gospels would have taken 8 full months. It needed up to 400 parchment sheets, which meant the skins of an entire herd of sheep or cattle. The copying activity of the monks of Ireland could not be done on a blackbird song. It implied an economic base in the form of endowments provided by the laity that were as stunning in their own time and as fiercely guarded by the great abbots of the major monasteries as are the endowments of Spear Library or of Firestone Library. Not everyone could hack it. There was once, says one life of a saint, there was once a young boy in the monastery of St. Comgall who was learning to write, but no one was able to read what he wrote. The result was more like the scratch of a bird's claw than human writing. He was at it many days. St. Comgall needed to perform a miracle to get the young lad's handwriting up to standard. He became, of course, a master calligrapher. Not every monk had the good fortune to be blessed by St. Comgall, but those who did emerge as skilled scribes carried with them an almost mystical aura. Here is a contemporary description of Ultan, an Irish scribe, setting to work to produce a great gospel book. For he could ornament books with fair markings, and by this art he made the shape of letters so beautiful one by one, for the Holy Ghost ruled his very fingers. In order to understand the cultural role of the monasteries in the Celtic churches, we have to enter into the very peculiar mystique of the Holy Scriptures in a church at the end of the world. As I pointed out in my last talk, here were books that had come to an entirely bookless land. The legends that grew up around Patricius in the course of the 7th century always emphasized moments of almost science fiction, close encounters between Patrick and the totally illiterate native Irish. What Patrick brought to Ireland was the holy white scriptures. His clergy were imagined as having advanced through a land where books were strange objects. The wooden writing tablets which they carried were mistaken for drawn white swords. In churches that he founded, Patrick would leave, so the 7th century legend said, psalters written in his own hand. To join the church as a monk or a clergyman was to obtain at once an entire new skill. When Patrick was on the road, he saw a gentle young warrior herding pigs. Patrick preached to him, baptized him, tonsured him, and gave him a gospel book. This was conversion Irish style as it was imagined around 700 A.D. It was the coming of the holy white scriptures. These stories tell us more about the position of monks and clergymen in Irish society in around 700 A.D. than they do about the real Patricius of 200 years earlier. What they tell us is the aura carried by holy books in a totally foreign language. For the Bible came to the Irish in Latin, and in Latin it remained. A Christian vernacular culture in Irish, in Scots Gaelic, and in Welsh grew up all round these holy scriptures. Like ivy climbing all over a solid building, the native languages came to cover their surfaces, pushed into every nook and cranny of their structure. Glosses, Irish equivalents written in, above, or beside difficult Latin words are a very typical feature of Bibles produced in the Celtic churches. But the building itself did not change. No one thought of translating the Bible directly from Latin into the native language. Alas, on this point, my compatriots notably failed to become Episcopalians, still less were they Presbyterians. Indeed, in this matter, they stand out as the true founders of the Catholic Middle Ages. They were the first Christian church in Western Europe, to whom Latin had come as an entirely strange language, not understood in any way by the people. And they wanted to keep it that way. For them it was a holy language. It was to be learned with pain only by the gifted few. It was far too good to be translated for the many, for it was the only proper language with which to talk to God in public. Intensely devout private prayers are the glory of Celtic poetry, but these were private prayers, as one said, in one's cell or in one's bedroom, when resting in the fields or when traveling. In the public prayers in every church and monastery, in the Celtic world as elsewhere in Western Europe, there was only one Christian sound, and that was the sound of Latin. And this, after all, was how it remained in much of Western Europe for the next millennium and a half, until in 1962 the Second Vatican Council authorized the performance of the Catholic liturgy in the vernacular. Once established as a sacred language, the act of copying the Latin scriptures in Ireland came to be tinged with the magical awe that had always surrounded the Aisdana, the people of skill. The Irish gave a high place in their society to master craftsmen. Their legendary cunning provided secular rulers with the ornaments and jewelry appropriate to their status. We need only look at Irish jewelry of this time, such as the great Tara brooch, which would have held the cloak of a king around his shoulder, to see how men of skill could work magic with small quantities of raw gold, fragments of semi-precious stones. They turned these raw materials into objects of haunting subtlety. Looking at such a brooch, the eye was pulled inward into a charmed world of interlaced patterns and writhing beasts. Such exquisite jewelry made concrete the face, the honor of their wearer. In the same way, the craftsmen of the great monasteries covered the vellum pages of gospel books with exquisite illuminations. The monks became the master craftsmen, the eis dana of the high King of heaven. They caused the honor of God to blaze from the page. They were not simply copying a text, they were showing that this was a holy text by turning parts of it into the equivalent of jewelry. Many of these precious gospel books have survived. The most famous of all can still be seen in the library of Trinity College, Dublin. It is called, from its last place of origin, the Book of Kells. But it was probably produced at Iona in around 750 AD. It was known as On Shoshge Lamor, the Great Gospel. Contemporaries spoke of it with awe. It was the high relic of the Western world. For the artistic skill that was lavished on it proved that this was a book radioactive with holiness. It was truly the product of cunning men, of eis dana, of almost supernatural skill. When, in around 1960, an attempt was made to make a facsimile edition of this marvel, it was discovered that no modern chemistry could replicate the dyes which had been used to make up the inks that colored its intricate jewel-like illuminations. A 12th century traveller to Ireland recorded his impression on looking at its pages. "If you look at them carelessly," he wrote, "you may judge them to be mere daubs. You would see nothing subtle where everything is subtle. But if you take the trouble to look very closely, to penetrate with your eyes to the secrets of the artistry, you will notice such intricacies, so delicate, so subtle, so involved and bound together, so fresh still in their colorings, that you will not hesitate to declare that all those things must have been the work not of men, but of angels." As is often the case with the history of the Celtic churches, spectacular achievements, such as the Book of Kells, make us forget the real miracle. And this was that the art of literacy, so dramatically focused on the production of the Holy Scriptures in a Latin that was totally opaque to the overwhelming majority of Irishmen, rapidly came to spill out of the monasteries to embrace the Irish language itself. Within 100 years of the death of Patricius, Irish emerged as the first written vernacular language in Western Europe. A totally non-Roman language had been caught in Roman script. Now, it's easy for modern people to forget what an extraordinary event this was. Until very recently, The arrival of literacy tended to destroy the native oral culture on which it impinged. In Ireland, the exact opposite happened. Codes of Irish law, masterpieces of complex bardic poetry, and full-scale epics which take us right back to the Bronze Age became fixed in writing due to the efforts of the same monks whose skills had turned the holy white scriptures into a work of angels. As a result, Christian Ireland came face to face with its own immediate pre-Christian past, caught by the clergy itself in the fixative of writing. To get an idea of what this meant, we must try to imagine an America where the epics and mythology of the Iroquois Indians had been lovingly preserved by the Pilgrim Fathers, and the great royal legends of the Aztecs and the Incas published under the auspices of the Spanish Inquisition. Yet this profoundly unlikely event was exactly what happened in Ireland in the course of the 7th century. Why? The most obvious reason is that, unlike so many Christianities of the Third World, which have been brought from the outside by the Europeans, the Irish converted themselves. The coming of Patricius, the maverick Romano-Briton, only started a process which the Irish warrior upper class and their colleagues, the men of skill of pre-Christian Ireland, rapidly made their own. It was they and not outsiders who set the tone for Irish Christianity. Thus, the truly decisive achievement of the 6th and 7th centuries was the Christianization of a vital section of Irish society, the Irish learned class. Small societies are not necessarily simple societies. The average Irish tribe might have no more than 300 to 1,000 members, but it was intensely stratified. We've already seen the brittle stratification of Irish society in the time of Patricius, with its fierce insistence on the differences between noblemen, free farmers, and slaves. There was room also in Irish society for entire castes of experts, each with their own arcane skills. The magical Aistana, the master craftsman. The Druids, experts on religion. Above all, the speakers of the law, the Brite Morn, were the guardians of legal memory and therefore were vital to law and order. Last but not least came the poets, the Fili, the seeing men, endowed with an almost uncanny gift for remembering the past and foretelling the future through their verses. It was these classes who, far from resisting Christianity, fastened with remarkable alertness on the most exotic of all goods to come into Ireland from the outside world, the skill of letters. They would use these new skills to maintain their own position in a changed world. By the year 700 AD, they had created their own version of the coming of Christianity to Ireland. They claimed that Patrick had established a special relationship with the learned classes of Ireland. It was the poet Dubtach Mac Lugair, a leading member of the Filiae, who had been the first to show signs of respect to Patricius by rising to meet him in the royal hall when he arrived at Tara. He had raised the knee to him, as he would to a visiting king. Dubtach then explained to Patrick the laws of Ireland. It was agreed between them that most of them were consistent with natural law. They did not need to be corrected greatly to bring them into harmony with the blessed white language of the written scriptures, the law of the letter. After the men of Ireland believed in Patrick, the two laws were joined, the law of nature, the ancient laws of Ireland, wrote an Irish text, and the law of the letter, the law of the written scriptures. And anything in the practice of the lawyers that was not opposed to the word of God in the law of the letter and to the consciences of believers was confirmed. Nowhere else in Europe at this time did any Christians give much thought to the issue of natural virtue among non-Christians. Yet here, in legendary terms, we have a debate on how much natural goodness had existed in non-Christians before the time of their conversion, and how much of their customs reflected that natural goodness, so that they did not need to be changed by Christian missionaries. Such a debate looks straight forward to the theological issues raised by modern missions. Those of us who still wrestle with such problems owe more than we realize to Dubtach mac Lugair. As a result of this alliance, sealed in retrospect by such vivid stories, Christianity did not destroy traditional culture in Ireland, as has frequently been the case when literacy impinges on non-literate societies. Instead, the introduction of literacy into Ireland unleashed a surge of creativity within the most traditional sectors of Irish upper-class society. Newly endowed with the skills of literacy, the guardians of traditional law and of traditional memory, the lawyers and the poets entered with gusto into a new age. Last but not least, there is one aspect of this remarkable process of adjustment which we modern Christians tend to overlook. Of all the Latin books brought into Ireland, it was the text of the Old Testament which formed the bridge between the two worlds. Its influence was decisive. Not for the last time in the history of the Church, the Old Testament provided men and women who lived in a harsh age, in a society still dominated by warfare and ruled by tribal law, with the moral roughage which the Gospels of themselves could not provide. The earthy texture of much of the Old Testament provided Irish Christians with exactly what they needed, a mirror in which to see their own society more clearly. From the frank practice of polygamy by the patriarchs to the flaunting of the heads of decapitated enemies by Joshua, by King David, there was nothing that happened in barbarian Ireland that had not already happened in the Old Testament. This meant, in fact, that the blessing of God might rest upon the ways of the Irish, as it was known to have rested once on the chosen people of Israel, despite their rough ways. This gave the Irish a way to grapple with the very real existence in their Christian present of a very ancient pre-Christian past. They could treat the past customs of Ireland as if they were, as it were, their own Old Testament. Like the Old Testament, they were seen as practices suited to a period of preparation for the coming of the holy white scriptures, associated with the message of the Gospels. Seen in this way, pre-Christian Ireland took on a touch of the majestic strangeness of ancient Israel, It was a world both left behind and yet, like the Old Testament, forever present. The classic statement of this view is contained in the great collection of Irish law known as the Cinque Mor, the great collection of tradition. The great tradition was put together around 720 AD. It marked the end of an epoch of extraordinary creativity. It declared the unity of an entire new Christian region. It was a code written for all lawyers in the entire Irish-speaking world, which at this time stretched, of course, far beyond Ireland, all along the western coast of Scotland. In the Cinque Mor, the ancient laws of Ireland were brought into the Christian present by being treated as if they were an adjunct to the Old Testament. Altogether, the use of the Old Testament in the Cinque Mor provided Irish lawyers with a firm middle ground in which to stand between the Christian present and traditions inherited from the past of their own land. Polygamy, for instance, was forbidden in the Christian churches, but it continued to be practiced by the warrior elite throughout Ireland. Yet polygamy was taken for granted in the Old Testament. Who was to tell which law was better? Validated by the example of the Old Testament, polygamy might yet have a place in Christian Ireland. In the words of a contemporary law text, there is a dispute in Irish law as to which is the more proper, whether many sexual unions or a single one. For the chosen people of God lived in a plurality of unions, so that it is not easier to condemn it than to praise it. This was perhaps to overdo it. One should not trust an Irish lawyer, perhaps even less than one trusts an Irish poet. He may have been trying to put one over on his readers. Yet in no other part of Western Europe had native lawyers and clergymen collaborated so urgently and so successfully to bind together Christian present and non-Christian past. It is this robust acceptance of their own past which gave the clergy and the monasteries of Ireland the confidence to reach out to minister firmly and with unparalleled conscientiousness to the society around them. We can see this most clearly in the novel way in which they handle the issue of sin, confession, and penance. And this, the world of the Celtic penitentials, will be the subject of my last talk.